You won't believe what the hospital camera captured that night. A premature baby who had never smiled. A barking sound from a room where no dogs were allowed. And a silent presence returned from beyond, only to do one thing. Keep a child breathing. The alarms didn't sound. The nurses didn't hear. But something moved, slowly, toward a leaking oxygen tank. No footprints, no witness, only a little girl standing beside the incubator whispering, "My baby brother's crying." But it's okay. The dog is watching him. You're about to enter a true story haunting, mysterious, and deeply human, where love refuses to die and loyalty survives death itself. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel to catch the next powerful and mysterious episodes we bring to life. Now, hold your breath. In room 403, Claire Campbell gripped the sheets with white knuckles, her auburn hair plastered to her face with sweat. Her breath came in sharp gasps, short, desperate attempts to stay present, to not let the pain take her under. But it was coming like a storm tide, like something old and powerful and unwilling to wait. "Where's Liam?" she cried out. Her voice cracked like a twig underfoot. "We called him." "He's on his way," a nurse replied, placing a hand on Claire's shoulder. "You need to focus on your breathing, Claire. Can you do that for your baby?" "My baby isn't supposed to be here yet," Claire cried. "He's not ready." "Neither are we," the nurse thought, but didn't say it. The fetal monitor began to spike, numbers dancing erratically like fireflies trapped in glass. The baby's heart rate was slowing. The OB team flooded the room like soldiers into battle. Hands moved fast IV lines, gloves snapping cold tools laid out like metal prayers on sterile trays. Outside the window, thunder rolled softly. The kind that doesn't startle but settles like a warning. Then the bleeding started. "Placental abruption," one of the doctors muttered. "We're losing the placenta." Claire screamed, and her scream was raw, not just from the tearing inside her body, but from the realization, deep primal, that she was no longer in control. This wasn't a birth anymore. This was survival. "Prep for emergency C-section," barked the lead surgeon. "NICU is standing by. Get that incubator ready." The operating room was chaos wrapped in protocol. Blue gowns, bright lights, beeping machines, sterile air filled with unspoken prayers. Claire's eyes fluttered open just as they began the incision. Her hand reached out into the void, as if searching for something, anything to hold on to. A nurse took her fingers gently. "He'll be okay," she whispered without knowing if that was true. They worked quickly. Seconds turned to minutes, and then the room fell silent. A sound was missing. There was no cry. Claire's heart stuttered. Her mind screamed what her mouth couldn't. Why isn't he crying? The tiny body they lifted from her looked like something unfinished. A child, but too small, too still. Purple-blue skin, limp arms, fragile legs folded like paper. He wasn't breathing. The team moved like lightning. Suction, oxygen, CPR with 2 fingers, no time to weigh, no time to name. They transferred him immediately to the incubator, the clear humming machine that would have to be his womb now. His second chance. Down the corridor, Liam burst through the ER doors, rain soaking his shirt, his shoes skidding on the polished floors. A nurse met him halfway. "Your son is alive," she said. "But he's critical, very critical." Liam didn't speak. His eyes begged for more, for a reason to hope. "We're doing everything we can." He rushed to the viewing window of the NICU, where Claire lay still under anesthesia, and where a glass chamber now held their son. Tubes snaked into the baby's tiny nose and chest. Machines beeped in different pitches, a symphony of fragile life. Nurses moved in practiced choreography. One of them adjusted the temperature. Another monitored his oxygen saturation, which was dangerously low. A third carefully placed a knitted hat on the baby's head to help conserve heat. It was blue. Someone had chosen it from a drawer full of anonymous hats made by strangers. The baby's name tag read, "Baby Campbell, male, 920. He wasn't Henry yet. He was still an if. 2 hours later, Claire awoke groggy in recovery. "Did he make it?" she asked, her throat raw, her voice paper thin. Liam nodded, though the answer felt like a half-truth. "He's fighting." That night, Claire was wheeled into the NICU for the first time. She saw her son through the incubator's curved glass, a world apart, though, just inches away. He was the size of her forearm. His skin was translucent. His chest rose and fell with mechanical help. She couldn't hold him. She could only watch. Only speak through the slits in the incubator's walls, as if whispering through a veil. "I'm your mom," she said. "I'm sorry it's so loud out here." She placed one hand on the glass, careful not to shake it. Liam stood beside her. He didn't cry. He couldn't afford to. But his hand trembled as he pressed it against the glass, too. A nurse came over. "You can touch him if you like. Just 2 fingers through the port. Skin to skin's too risky right now, but he might like to feel you." Claire reached in slowly, hands scrubbed in sanitized movements, tentative. Her fingers brushed her son's ankle. He flinched. A moment, a reflex, a connection. Back at home, their daughter Emma sat on the couch, clutching a stuffed bear. She was only 5, but her world had already changed. Her grandma explained to her that baby Henry had come early and needed special help. "Will he come home?" Emma asked. "We hope so, sweetheart." I drew him something. She held up a picture of a big baby and a tiny baby holding hands. "That's me and him." In the hospital, the days blurred. Night became background. Meals were forgotten. Claire pumped milk every 3 hours, though Henry couldn't take it yet. The nurses labeled and froze each container like treasure. Every day they visited the NICU. Every day they waited. Claire read him stories through the glass. Liam brought tiny socks, even though they never fit. They watched numbers rise and fall, oxygen levels, blood pressure, temperature. They learned the language of alarms. They learned which beeps were bad and which were worse. The doctors explained that his lungs weren't developed, that the next 72 hours were crucial, that any infection could end it all. At night, Claire sat in her hospital bed, staring at the rain again. This time it wasn't peaceful. It felt like the world weeping outside her window. She whispered, "I'm sorry, baby. I didn't mean to let you go so soon." On the 3rd night, something changed. Emma came to visit. The NICU had strict policies, but she was allowed to stand beside the incubator for a few moments, under close watch. She looked at her baby brother, eyes wide with wonder. "He's small," she whispered. Claire smiled weakly. "Yeah." Emma leaned close, forehead almost touching the glass. She studied his face. Then her own expression changed. Her lips trembled. Her eyes watered. She began to cry, not loud, but deep. A child's quiet, broken sob. Claire moved to comfort her, but Emma whispered something so soft, so strange, it froze the air around them. "He's crying, but it's okay. The dog is guarding him." Claire blinked. "What?" Emma didn't look away from Henry. "He's scared, but the dog is there. The yellow one, with the shiny eyes." Liam and Claire exchanged a glance. A nurse raised her brow. "Sweetheart, there's no dog," Liam said gently. Emma insisted. "Yes, there is. He's under the box. He's licking Henry's feet." Claire knelt beside her, brushing hair from her daughter's face. "Did you dream this?" Emma shook her head. "He told me." "Who?" She pointed to the incubator. "Henry." "But Henry can't talk." Emma looked up confused, not with words. That night after they left, a nurse on duty noticed something strange. One of the oxygen tanks had a slight leak, nothing alarming, barely noticeable. But when she checked the flow rate, her stomach sank. It was much lower than it should have been. Henry's levels were dipping slowly, quietly. Too quietly. The monitor hadn't registered a fault. The alarm hadn't gone off. Had no one noticed? He could have gone into hypoxia. She quickly replaced the tank, adjusted the valves, and manually reset the alarm system. Then she filed a report. Before leaving the room, she checked the camera log, just routine. What she heard chilled her. In the audio feed, buried beneath the hum of machinery, soft as breath was a sound. A low, steady barking. Soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. A dog, inside a sterile dogless room. And in that fragile hour between night and morning, the veil between what is and what cannot be, thinned just enough to let something through. Something loyal, something protective, something more than memory. Narration. Some lives don't enter the world with a cry. They arrive in silence, carried by storms, kept breathing by the love of those who wait, and perhaps the love of something more. The NICU never really sleeps. It hums, it breathes, it murmurs, with the mechanical rhythm of machines sustaining lives that have barely begun. It's not a ward so much as a world, a quiet, blinking constellation of incubators, each one holding a fragile flame that flickers between existence and disappearance. The The walls echo not with cries but with cautious hope and the muted language of survival. Henry lay at the far end of the unit, in the corner, where the lights were dimmer and the nurses lingered longer. On the glass shell of his incubator, condensation gathered in a soft arc. Inside his chest rose and fell with the assistance of the ventilator. The oxygen tube feeding into his tiny nose hissed gently like a lullaby, composed by science. Claire stood beside it, unmoving. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't seeing what was in front of her. She was somewhere else, somewhere months earlier before everything changed. She had felt him kick for the first time while she was folding laundry. A gentle thump low on her belly, as if he were knocking from the inside to say, "I'm here." They had argued over names, then Henry or August. She liked Henry because it felt grounded, like an anchor, like something you say softly in a storm and it makes the world pause. Liam preferred August. "He'll be a force of nature," he'd said. Now watching Henry tethered to a wall of machines, both names felt too big for someone so small. Claire wiped her eyes and pressed her palm against the incubator's glass. "I wish I could hold you," she whispered. "Just once." They came every day, rain or shine. Liam brought her coffee, even though she never finished it. She'd just hold the cup like it might warm the places inside her that had grown cold. He would talk to the nurses, ask the same questions, get the same answers. No major changes, still stable. We're watching closely, but the numbers told their own story. The oxygen saturation fluctuated. Sometimes it dipped, triggering a soft alarm, beep beep, then climbed back again like a child learning to breathe. Emma came with them most days. The hospital had made an exception for her after the incident with the leak. They said she was calm, quiet, observant. What they meant was she didn't disturb the fragile peace of the NICU. She always brought drawings. The first was a family of stick figures, Claire, Liam, Emma, and a very small Henry, inside a big heart. She'd colored it with crayon, careful to keep within the lines. The nurse taped it to the incubator. The second was more detailed. It had clouds and sunshine and a big yellow dog sleeping under a tree. Emma pointed to it and said, "That's Bruno. He watches Henry when we go home." Liam's hand froze in midair. Claire said nothing. No one had told her the dog's name. No one had told her there was a dog at all. By the 5th day, the monotony had turned into a ritual. Claire sat in the same plastic chair, crossed her legs the same way, and watched the same series of lights blink on Henry's monitor. Liam would pace every 15 minutes, pause by the window, then return. Emma would sit with a coloring book, eyes darting between her pages and her brother. The nurses changed shifts. The machines kept ticking. Inside the incubator, Henry didn't cry. He didn't move much. He just existed. That was the cruel part. He was here but unreachable, like a song playing behind a locked door. Claire started bringing her journal to the hospital. She didn't write about the present. The present was too loud, too sharp. She wrote about the first time they heard his heartbeat, about how Liam had grabbed her hand in surprise when the galloping rhythm echoed from the ultrasound speaker. She wrote about cravings, peanut butter, and pickles, about the time she sang Blackbird to her belly and felt a twitch like he was dancing. She wrote down every name they had considered: Lucas, Ethan, Jude, Henry, and then she stopped writing. She stared at the page until her eyes blurred, then slowly tore it out and folded it into a paper crane. She left it on top of the incubator. One afternoon, Henry's monitor screamed. Beep, 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 beep. Claire jumped up so fast the chair fell over. A nurse rushed in, followed by a doctor. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 79. They adjusted the tube, increased the flow, and ran checks for blockages. Henry's skin had gone a bluish tinge. The nurse spoke calmly, but with urgency. "We're stabilizing. You might want to step outside." But Claire refused. "I'm his mother," she said. "I'm not leaving." The beeping slowed. Gradually, the numbers rose. 81, 85, 91. The crisis passed. But something in Claire didn't go back to normal. A tiny part of her had cracked. She didn't cry, not yet. That night when they went home, she sat in the parked car for nearly an hour without speaking. Liam didn't push. Some losses don't announce themselves. They arrive silently and sit next to you like old friends. Inside the NICU, Henry opened his eyes for the first time. It lasted only seconds. But the night nurse noticed and wrote it down. Henry Campbell, opened eyes 2 sec closed, unresponsive to light, no distress, stable. But she didn't mention the other thing, the sound she heard just before, a soft, brief bark. Barely audible, like a breath disguised as loyalty. By the 7th day, Claire's shoulders hunched more. Liam's jokes faded. Emma's drawings turned darker, more pencil, less color. And yet they kept coming. They stood around the glass box like worshippers around an altar. They prayed in different ways. Claire with her silence, Liam with his questions, Emma with her stories. One morning, Emma leaned in and whispered to her brother, "When you come home, you can sleep in my room. But only if Bruno says it's okay." Claire looked at her, blinking. "Emma," she said slowly, Did you have a dog before?" Emma shook her head. "No. Bruno's not mine. He belongs to Henry." Claire swallowed, her hands clenched. A nurse walked by adjusting Henry's feeding line. She smiled at Emma. "What's your dog's name again?" "Bruno." The nurse froze. She turned to Claire. "Did you say Bruno?" Claire nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what she's been calling him." The nurse didn't speak for a moment. Then she cleared her throat. "We had a therapy dog that used to visit years ago. Golden retriever. Named Bruno. He passed away in a fire when the east wing caught during renovations." Claire stared at her. "That was almost 30 years ago," the nurse added, almost embarrassed. Emma was still coloring. She didn't hear them. Claire stood up, her legs unsteady. She walked back to Henry's incubator and looked down. He twitched. Not much, but enough. Claire placed her fingers through the port and let them rest lightly on his foot. "Henry," she whispered, "if someone's watching over you, I hope he stays. I hope he never leaves." And for the first time since his birth, she cried. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, but because for one strange moment in the middle of fluorescent lights and medical alarms, she felt like her son wasn't alone. The monitor pulsed. Beep, beep, beep. Regular, strong, alive. The hospital never seemed to sleep. But the night had a way of quieting even the most persistent machines. Around 2:17 a.m., the NICU dimmed its lights, and the corridors outside were deserted except for the soft patter of nurses' shoes and the occasional clink of IV carts. It was the kind of silence that made you think the world was holding its breath. Henry's corner of the NICU glowed faintly, surrounded by the low hum of monitors and the glass barrier that separated his tiny vulnerable form from everything else. The monitor near his bed gave off its usual steady pulse beep, 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 like the heartbeat of something unseen, something ancient and waiting. It had been a difficult day. His oxygen levels had dipped twice. A nurse had made an offhand comment about preliminary signs of infection, and Claire hadn't slept since. Liam had paced for hours before finally heading home to tuck Emma into bed. But Emma hadn't wanted to sleep, not that night. She'd begged to go back to the hospital, insisting in that gentle, stubborn way children do that Henry needed her. "He's scared," she said. Claire had tried to reason with her. "He doesn't know what scared is, sweetheart. He's just a baby." But Emma had only looked up and said, "Yes, he does. And he's not alone." Claire relented, not because she believed her, but because it was easier than another argument. And maybe, just maybe, because some part of her wanted to believe that Henry could feel them nearby, even in the stillness of his incubator, even in a room lined with glass and grief. They returned after midnight. Emma held Claire's hand as they walked the hallway. The security guard raised an eyebrow but let them pass. Claire signed them in with the sleepy confidence of a mother who knew her way around the battlefield. Inside the NICU, the nurse on duty gave them a tired smile. "He's stable. No more dips since 10 p.m. Claire nodded and took the same seat she always did. Emma, however, didn't sit. She stood beside Henry's incubator in silence. Her eyes were locked onto him, as if trying to see something deeper, something the adults couldn't. She didn't speak for nearly 5 minutes. Then she started to cry, not loud, but deep. A kind of cry that came from a place too old for her age. Her shoulders trembled. Her lip quivered. And as Claire turned to comfort her, Emma said something that made time pause. "He's crying too," she whispered. Claire leaned in, kneeling to her daughter's level. "Honey, he's not. He can't cry. He's still intubated." Emma wiped her face with the sleeve of her pajama top and shook her head. "Not with his mouth. He's crying inside. I feel it." Claire blinked, unsure how to respond. Then came the second part, the part that would echo in her memory like thunder in a church. "But it's okay," Emma said, her voice cracking. "The dog is here." Claire froze. "What dog?" she asked slowly. Emma pointed under the incubator. "Right there. He's laying down." He licked Henry's feet and told him not to be scared. Claire turned instinctively, But of course there was nothing there. Just cold tile and the wheels of the incubator cart. No fur, no movement, no dog. She tried to smile, tried to soothe. "Sweetie, that's not. He has golden fur." Emma interrupted, her eyes clear despite the tears. "And big ears. He smells like smoke." Claire felt a chill crawl across her back. "Emma, why would you say he smells like smoke?" "I don't know," Emma said, shaking her head. "But Henry isn't scared anymore. The dog told him he'd stay until morning." Claire stood slowly, her heartbeat out of rhythm. Her mouth was dry. She glanced at the nurse, who had been quietly watching the entire time. The woman didn't speak either, just stared at Emma like she was looking at something she couldn't explain. Later that night, security footage captured the scene. A little girl barefoot in her pajamas, standing in front of her brother's incubator. Her head bowed, her hands clenched into fists. The timestamp flickered in the bottom right corner of the frame. At 2:19 a.m., Emma looked directly into the incubator and whispered something inaudible. At 2:20 a.m., she turned, faced the nurse's station, and mouthed something that upon lip-reading review appeared to be, "He's okay now." At 2:22 a.m., the camera microphone, rarely reviewed unless for legal reasons, picked up an unfamiliar sound. Not human, not mechanical. A low, steady bark, muted, measured, just one or two, then nothing. Claire didn't sleep that night. She lay in the hospital cot beside Henry's room, watching her son through the glass. She kept thinking about the way Emma had spoken. Not like a child making something up, but like someone who had seen something so real. She couldn't understand why no one else did. When Liam returned the next morning, Claire pulled him aside. She saw something, she whispered. "Saw what?" She said there was a dog. A golden one. Under Henry's incubator. Liam gave a tired laugh. "She's 5, Claire. It's her imagination. She's been here every day watching us panic, cry, watch monitors beep like bombs. Of course she's imagining things." Claire didn't smile. She said he smelled like smoke. That stopped Liam mid-sentence. Claire lowered her voice. "She said the dog licked Henry's feet and told him not to be scared." Liam rubbed his face. "Claire, we haven't talked about fire or smoke, and we definitely haven't told her about—" "I know," she said. "That's what scares me." Back home that afternoon, Emma sat at the kitchen table with her crayons and a blank sheet of paper. Claire made tea with trembling hands, unsure whether to ask questions or leave it alone. Eventually, Emma held up the drawing. It was a dog. A golden retriever, to be exact, colored carefully with deep brown eyes and ears that flopped forward. Behind the dog was something that looked like a fire-orange scribbles and red streaks, though the dog himself was untouched by it. Beneath it, in childlike handwriting, Bruno. Claire nearly dropped the teacup. She sat down across from her daughter, voice shaking. "Where? Did you hear that name?" Emma shrugged. "He told me." "When?" "Last night." Claire stared at her. "Did you make up that name?" Emma looked confused. "No, Mommy. That's just his name. He said his job is to keep Henry safe. He said he's done it before." Claire couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. Her father, Emma's grandfather, had a golden retriever named Bruno when she was a child. He'd died in a house fire, saving her younger brother. Bruno had dragged the boy out before the flames reached the nursery. The dog hadn't made it back. They'd never talked about it with Emma. It had happened decades ago. There were no photos in the house, no stories told, just memory, and maybe something more. That night, Claire stood again by the incubator, her fingers pressed lightly against the glass. Henry was sleeping. His numbers were strong. For the first time, she let herself smile, only for a moment. Then the monitor beeped. Just once, just enough to pull her back to reality. But Henry didn't stir. He stayed calm, peaceful. The ventilator hissed in steady intervals. Claire closed her eyes, placed her hand flat against the glass, and whispered, "Bruno, if you're still here, thank you." Behind her, Emma whispered too. "He said you're welcome." It started as a flicker, subtle, barely a tremble in the numbers. At 3:06 a.m., the monitor above Henry's incubator dipped for the first time. The oxygen saturation dropped to 91%, then to 88%. No alarms sounded. No lights flashed. The nurse on duty, Miriam, had been stationed at the front desk a few feet away, finishing patient logs and sipping cold coffee from a chipped mug. The ward was quiet. One of the rare moments when everything seemed to be holding steady. She glanced at the central monitor wall, all readings green, except something nagged at her. Not visual, not auditory, just a feeling, like the air had thickened, like the kind of quiet you notice only when it shouldn't be there. She stood stretching the ache from her shoulders, a habit born from decades in NICU night shifts. As she approached Henry's unit, she noticed the baby's skin paler than usual. His limbs, once slightly pink from stimulation therapy, looked almost translucent. His lips were edged in blue. Miriam froze. The oxygen gauge on the portable tank beside the incubator blinked steadily, reading normal. But Henry didn't look normal. She bent closer, tapped the gauge, rechecked the saturation. 86%. Still no alarm. Her chest tightened. Come on, she muttered, pulling her stethoscope from around her neck. She placed it gently on Henry's paper-thin chest. The ventilator hissed softly, but his breaths, they were shallow. Too shallow. She turned the dial on the oxygen regulator slightly. Nothing changed. A sickening chill washed over her as realization dawned. This wasn't a sensor error. Something was wrong with the tank. She unhooked the tubing in one smooth motion and swapped to the wall-mounted emergency supply. The oxygen hissed sharply into place, the sound loud in the night silence of the NICU. Within 30 seconds, Henry's color began to return. Slowly, pink crept back into his cheeks, like life was remembering how to live in him again. The monitor steadied, 92%, 94%, 97%. But Miriam's relief was short-lived, because none of this should have happened in the first place. Back at her desk, she pulled up the maintenance report for the oxygen tanks. The one Henry had been using had passed its last check. No known leaks, no alerts. She checked the digital log. It had been last accessed 5 hours ago by a nurse on the previous shift, nothing unusual. But still Miriam's gut twisted. She filed an incident report and marked it as high priority. Still something gnawed at her. The alarm. Why hadn't it gone off? She ran diagnostics on the monitoring system. The code came back clean. But the log showed that the alarm had in fact tried to trigger. Timestamp 0305 Attempted activation. Low O2 saturation alert. Result failed. Audio path interruption. The system had tried to scream and had choked. Miriam stared at the screen. This wasn't just equipment failure. This was negligence waiting to become tragedy. The next morning, Liam and Claire arrived early. Claire, bleary-eyed from another night of shallow, broken sleep, leaned in to kiss Henry through the incubator's sterile slit. She paused, then gasped. His skin had healed from its pallor, but only barely. What happened to his color, she asked. Miriam hesitated, then chose honesty. There was a leak in the oxygen tank last night, she said. We caught it early. He's okay. He's stable now. Claire's heart stopped. How early, Liam asked. Miriam hesitated again. He was dipping. Mid-80s. I switched him over before it dropped further. Claire stared at her. No alarm? No, Miriam admitted. System glitch. It's under investigation. Liam looked down at his son, a storm brewing behind his eyes. And if you hadn't checked? Miriam didn't answer. She didn't have to. They didn't talk on the way home. The silence was too thick. But at dinner that night, Emma looked up from her plate and said simply, Bruno barked. Claire froze. Her fork hovered midair. What did you say? Emma repeated it without fear. Bruno barked last night, loud. Liam leaned in. When? After the beep, she said. The one the machines didn't hear. Claire whispered. You heard it? Emma shook her head. No, I felt it. Like thunder in my tummy. Neither parent knew what to say. But both felt the same pull toward a truth they couldn't articulate. The next evening, Miriam stayed late. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. That there was more to what happened than a faulty regulator and a silenced alarm. She requested access to the security footage for Henry's unit. The hospital IT team sent over a 20-minute clip. From 2:55 a.m. to 3:15 a.m. She opened it. The footage played back in real time. Nothing unusual. The camera was mounted high in the corner of the room, giving a wide-angle view of Henry's incubator, the oxygen tank, the machines. At 3:05:41, Henry stirred. His chest moved less. His limbs twitched. No sound from the machines. No sign of distress. Then at 3:06, the baby's foot kicked slightly. And that's when it happened. The camera's mic, mostly ambient static, picked up a faint, distant woof. Not a bark, not aggressive, just one low, even-toned sound. A warning. A call. Then another 6 seconds later. Same pitch, same rhythm. Soft, steady, dog-like. Miriam leaned in, stunned. She replayed the clip again, boosted the audio. And there it was. Woof, woof, like a metronome of warning. As if something unseen had barked not out of fear but duty. And then silence. Just the hiss of the oxygen being corrected. Just the faint beep of the monitor finding balance. Miriam sat back in her chair, hands trembling. There were no dogs allowed in the NICU. No therapy animals scheduled. No visitors at that hour. The hallways had been empty, and yet, that sound, it didn't belong. But somehow it belonged more than anything else. The next day, Miriam printed the audiograph. It showed two sharp, identical waveforms. She brought it to the attending physician, unsure what to say. He read it, shrugged. Could be anything. Chair scraping, machinery. The system burps sometimes. Miriam pushed. I've worked here 23 years. I know what this place sounds like at night. That wasn't a machine. The doctor didn't respond. Just slid the report back across the desk. Miriam walked out angrier than she expected to be, not because he dismissed her, but because she'd started to believe it too. Claire, meanwhile, sat in the family lounge with a printed photo of her childhood dog in her lap. Bruno, his eyes warm and deep. She hadn't seen this photo in years. It had been buried in a storage bin in the garage. And yet when she'd gone looking for it that morning, she found it in the first box she opened, almost like it had been waiting. Henry stirred in his incubator. His hand twitched again. His eyes fluttered open just for a second. And that was when Claire whispered it, barely audible through her tears. I know it was you. The curtain had been pulled back, not wide, just a sliver, but enough. Enough to see that not everything invisible is imagined. Some things are simply waiting to be noticed. Some barks don't need mouths. Some guardians never leave their post. In the sterile heart of St. Vincent's Hospital, a mystery was quietly unraveling. Not with sirens, not with declarations, but with questions whispered down. The halls passed between staff like contraband. It started with a sound. Two, really. Soft rhythmic barks that shouldn't have existed. Miriam hadn't said much. Just filed her report and uploaded the audio clip to the hospital server with a note, unidentified audio from NICU room 12. Please review. No one responded for days. Then someone did. A technician from facilities. A quiet man named Glenn, who rarely looked people in the eye, called her up on the internal line and said, "That clip you flagged? Can you come down here?" She followed the long, beige corridor to the sublevel where maintenance and systems control lived in cold, humming silence. Screens lined the walls, most showing camera feeds or system diagnostics. Glenn waved her over to his desk. I isolated the sound, he said, not looking up from his screen. He clicked play. The room filled with static, low and distant. Then woof, woof. Same as before, same spacing, same tone. He boosted the frequency signature on a waveform graph. Whatever this is, he said, it's not a glitch. Miriam crossed her arms. Could it be environmental? Something outside, not unless dogs can get into a sound-sealed wing with biometric locks. She hesitated. So what are you saying? I don't know what I'm saying, he admitted. But this is a bark. I ran it through a canine recognition model I found online. He clicked a few keys. On screen appeared a side-by-side comparison of the NICU audio and a library sample. Golden Retriever. Male. Approx. 2-3 years of age at time of sample. Glenn sat back folding his hands. Matches up 91%. Miriam stared at the screen, trying to anchor herself in something logical. There are no dogs in that wing. I checked all access logs. No visitors logged between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. that night. Staff entry only. All accounted for. What about deliveries? None scheduled. Loading dock was locked. We have footage. She didn't speak for a while. Finally, she asked, "You ever believe in things you can't explain?" He looked at her for the first time. Not condescending, not amused. Just curious. Don't have to believe in them, he said. They happen anyway. Claire and Liam were called in the next morning under the vague pretense of discussing a safety incident involving the oxygen system. When they arrived, they were escorted not to the NICU, but to a private consultation room, the kind they'd only seen once before after Henry's emergency C-section. Kwan was already seated. Miriam stood near the door, arms folded tightly across her chest. Claire felt her stomach drop. Is Henry? He's fine, Dr. Kwan cut in gently. This isn't about his current condition. Liam, still catching his breath from the stairs, asked, Then why are we here? Miriam cleared her throat. We've been reviewing audio logs from the night of the oxygen tank failure. Claire straightened. You recorded something? Miriam nodded slowly. Dr. Kwan turned a laptop on the table toward them, pressed play. At first, only the faint hiss of medical machines. Then, woof, woof! Claire's eyes widened. Liam leaned in. What the hell? Dr. Kwan waited a moment before saying, There were no animals in the hospital that night. We've confirmed all entries, exits, and personnel locations. No therapy dogs, no visitors, no deliveries, no janitorial rotations. But you're saying this is a real sound, Claire asked. Miriam nodded. We ran it through a model. It's canine. Breed match came back as golden retriever. Liam exhaled. That's not possible. Claire didn't speak. She just looked down at the floor. Unless Miriam began. Claire raised her eyes slowly. Unless it's not from here. They drove home in silence, the kind that sits heavy on your chest and doesn't let you breathe all the way in. At home, Emma was sitting cross-legged in the living room, surrounded by crayons and a half-finished drawing. She looked up as her parents walked in and tilted her head. Did you hear the barks? Claire stopped mid-step. What did you say? Emma pointed at her drawing. It was of Henry in his incubator. And under it, drawn in soft yellow crayon, was a dog, curled up, its head resting on its paws. The dog barked, Emma said. So you would know he was helping. Liam crouched in front of her. Emma, did you see the dog again? She nodded. He sleeps under Henry's bed. Claire sat down slowly on the couch, her knees suddenly too weak to hold her. Emma continued as matter-of-fact as if she were talking about a classmate. He's big, soft, and he watches everyone, even the doctors. Liam asked. What does he look like? He's yellow, she said, with eyes like melted chocolate. Claire covered her mouth. Emma added, he smells like campfire, but not the scary part, the warm part. Liam looked at Claire. That's exactly how you used to describe him. Bruno, she whispered. Emma nodded. Yeah, that's his name. That night, Claire pulled a worn photo album from the top shelf of the hallway closet. She hadn't touched it in over a decade. Dust clung to the leather binding. Inside pages turned stiff with time revealed her childhood in faded color. Christmas mornings, first days of school, messy backyard birthday parties. And then near the middle, she found him. Bruno, a young golden retriever with a blue collar and eyes that seemed to look straight through the camera. She stared at the photo for a long time. When Emma wandered into the room, Claire turned it toward her. Emma didn't hesitate. That's him, she said. That's the one who sleeps under Henry. Claire's throat tightened. Are you sure? Emma reached out and gently touched the photo. I remember his ears, she said. They feel like Henry's blanket. Miriam requested access to the hospital archives. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she couldn't stop thinking about the sound. Maybe because she wanted proof, real proof that this was just a coincidence. But what she found wasn't nothing. The hospital had once kept therapy animals. A short-lived program in the early 90s. Canceled after budget cuts. Only one dog had ever been formally registered. Name Bruno. Breed golden retriever. Handler Robert King. Status deceased. Miriam stared at the record dated April 3, 1994. Cause of death, smoke inhalation. Incident West Wing nursery fire. She read the rest. Bruno had alerted staff to the fire by barking incessantly, even after alarms failed to trigger. He'd run back inside the smoke to pull out an infant that had been missed in the chaos. He didn't make it back out. Miriam printed the record and handed it to Claire the next morning. Claire read it without speaking. When she reached the last line, her hand shook. Why would he come back? She whispered. Miriam looked at her. Because he never left. That night, Claire and Liam returned to the hospital with a framed photo. They taped it just beside Henry's incubator. In the photo, Bruno sat beside a baby carriage in the backyard, alert, watchful, proud. Emma stood quietly nearby, smiling, as if she understood something the rest of them didn't. And as the machines pulsed and the ventilator whispered, Henry stirred gently in his sleep. His lips curled, just slightly, into a smile. It was raining again, and in the old house on Chestnut Street, the past stirred quietly between the walls. Claire had called her mother-in-law earlier that morning, not to ask but to tell. There had been too many signs, too many things that defied explanation. The barking, the oxygen leak, Emma's drawings, the photo, the name. Claire had barely finished the sentence when Helen said softly, "Come over." Now they were sitting at the dining room table, the smell of cinnamon tea curling into the corners of the room. Emma played quietly in the living room, coloring as usual, while Liam sat beside Claire, his jaw tight, his hands restless. Helen stood in front of the bookshelf for a long moment, running her fingers along the spines of albums weathered by time. They were all the same size, thick, padded, leather-bound books with tiny brass labels pressed into the covers. She finally pulled one out and brought it to the table. When she opened it, dust floated into the air like ash. She turned pages slowly, past baby photos of Liam. Birthday parties with paper hats and chocolate-smudged smiles, until she landed on a photo that stopped the room. A dog, golden fur, tongue out, eyes impossibly gentle. "Bruno." Claire felt the breath leave her. Emma wandered in and looked over the table. "That's him," she said simply. "That's the dog from the hospital." Helen didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply said, "Of course it is." Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me everything." Helen sat down, her eyes distant but sharp. It was winter. 30 years ago. Liam was just a baby. Maybe 2, maybe not even. We were living in the old house out by the pine grove, the one your father tore down. Claire nodded. She remembered the stories. The house that burned. "There was a heater in the nursery," Helen continued. "An old gas unit. I'd meant to replace it. That night I remember lighting it, and then falling asleep on the couch. I didn't mean to. I was just so tired." She stopped. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested on the photo. "I woke up to Bruno barking. Not just barking, screaming. That's the only word I can use. He was at the hallway door, his nails scraping the floor. The whole house smelled like burning plastic." Helen closed her eyes. "When I opened the nursery door, smoke poured out like it was alive. I dropped to the floor crawling, but I couldn't see a thing. I couldn't even find Liam. I kept calling his name. But the smoke," her voice cracked. "I don't know how he did it. Bruno ran in past me, straight into the black. I tried to grab him, but he was gone. And then maybe 10 seconds later, he came back, dragging Liam by the collar of his pajama shirt. Liam wasn't breathing. I pulled him into the kitchen and called the fire department." She paused. "When I turned back, Bruno was still inside." Claire felt tears sting her eyes. Helen looked down at the photo. "They said he collapsed under the crib, asphyxiated. There was too much smoke. He must have passed out instantly." Liam wiped his eyes and cleared his throat. "I never knew the whole story." Helen looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You were too young. We didn't talk about it. Your father couldn't. He blamed himself for leaving that heater in." She turned back to the photo. "After that, I dreamed about Bruno for months. I'd wake up to the sound of him walking through the hall. I'd hear his tags jingle in the kitchen. Once I felt him press his nose against my hand when I was sleeping. I know what grief can do, but it never felt like grief. It felt like loyalty." Emma slid into the seat beside her. He stayed. Helen smiled gently. "Yes, baby." He stayed. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the album. There were pictures of Bruno curled on the porch, guarding the stroller, playing fetch with Liam in the backyard. In one, he was wearing a red scarf. His tongue hung out of the side of his mouth, and his eyes sparkled with something that felt too human to be canine. Claire stared at it for a long time. "What if he really came back?" she asked softly. Helen didn't hesitate. "He never left." Liam rubbed his hands together, uneasy. "But why now? After all this time?" Helen looked at him. "Because Henry needed him. And because once a soul is bound to love, it doesn't obey time like we do." Claire reached for another photo and paused. It was dated April 2nd, 1994, the day before the fire. Bruno was sitting beside Liam's crib, his eyes focused, alert, like he already knew. Back at the hospital, Miriam printed a copy of the incident report and brought it to her supervisor again. But this time she added a note at the bottom. "Recommend archival cross-check with canine therapy program. Bruno Golden Retriever deceased April 1994. Incident pattern resembles documented behavior." Her supervisor called her an hour later. "You know this sounds insane, right?" Miriam didn't flinch. So did a silent alarm and a dying baby. 3 nights later, Emma insisted on staying overnight with Claire in the hospital's parent suite. She said Bruno had told her he wanted her close. At 2:33 a.m., Claire awoke to Emma standing beside her bed. "He's cold," Emma said. "Henry's cold." Claire rushed to the NICU. The nurse on duty was already there, adjusting the warming controls on Henry's incubator. His temperature had dipped without cause, but nothing serious. Still stable. Emma walked over and crouched down beside the incubator, staring into the small gap underneath it. "He's there," she whispered. "He always is." Claire sat beside her, putting her arm around her shoulder. Emma looked up. "He said he saved Daddy too." Claire nodded, a lump in her throat. "Yes, he did." That morning, Claire asked Helen for something specific. "If you still have it," she said. "I need it." Later that afternoon, Helen arrived with a box wrapped in soft blue paper. Inside was an old red scarf. Bruno's. It still smelled faintly of pine and dust and something warm. Claire folded it neatly and placed it just outside the incubator window where Henry could see it, if only in dreams. The nurse who took the next shift found a note taped above the scarf. For Bruno, thank you. She didn't ask. She just smiled. And for a brief moment, when no one was watching, she swore she heard the gentle tap of paws across the linoleum floor. Too soft for alarms, too real to be forgotten, because love doesn't vanish. It lingers. It returns. And sometimes, if the world is quiet enough and the need is great enough, it barks. The morning Henry smiled. The air in the NICU felt different. Thicker, quieter. Not heavy, not ominous, just still. Like the moment before a hymn begins. Like breath being held in reverence. Helen arrived at dawn. She didn't ring. She didn't ask permission. She walked through the automatic doors of St. Vincent's with the slow, certain pace of someone who had made peace with what she could never explain. In her hand was a small wooden box, polished but worn at the edges. Inside it, wrapped in a linen cloth that still carried the scent of cedar, was a framed photo. Bruno, his fur golden and windswept, his eyes fixed on something just outside the frame. Claire met her at the security door, eyes swollen from another sleepless night. Helen said nothing. She simply reached out and took her daughter-in-law's hand. Is today the right day? Claire asked. Helen nodded. He's here. They entered the NICU together. The nurses didn't ask questions. They knew the family by now, knew their rhythms, their rituals, their griefs and hopes. They had seen Emma talk to the empty corners of the room, had heard the stories, had read the reports. They had even listened to the bark. No one doubted anymore. Helen approached Henry's incubator slowly, reverently. She didn't wear her usual perfume today, just the scent of wind and soap and time. In her other hand was a single stick of incense, lavender and sandalwood, hand-rolled from a shop on the east side where the owner always gave her one extra for free. Only light it when you need something to find its way home, the woman had once said. Helen lit the incense with a match, the flame small and trembling, then blew it out gently. The smoke rose in lazy spirals, dancing above the plastic curve of the incubator, like something alive, something ancient. The scent filled the room slowly, wrapping itself around the beeping monitors and sterile machinery, like a soft exhale. Claire stood at the head of the bed, her hand on Henry's tiny chest. Liam stood behind her, arms folded, jaw set in quiet reverence. And Emma, still in her pajamas, watched with wide eyes. Helen placed the framed photo on the ledge beside the incubator, leaning it carefully against the monitor stand. Bruno stared out from behind the glass eyes, warm mouth slightly open like he was mid-laugh. Then Henry moved, not just a twitch. He opened his eyes, slowly, sleepily. And then he smiled, a full, unmistakable, impossibly serene smile. The kind of smile a baby gives when they recognize someone that the world says they shouldn't be able to. Claire gasped. Emma whispered, "See, he knows." Liam stepped forward, blinking back something too large to swallow. He's never smiled before. Claire leaned down close enough to see the reflection of Bruno's photo in Henry's wide, wet eyes. And he smiled again, longer this time, eyes crinkling. At the dog, at the ghost, at the friend who never left. The nurse on duty had seen 1,000 babies. She'd heard first cries, last breaths, triumphant recoveries, and quiet defeats. But she'd never seen that look before. Henry, just weeks old, no exposure to pets, no recognition training, not even visual contact strong enough for tracking, was responding to a photograph. Not a toy, not a parent, not a face he'd ever seen in life. And yet his body knew, his nervous system knew. Something inside him reached toward the photo like a flower toward the sun. The nurse didn't speak. She simply made a note on his chart. First smile observed. Stimulus photograph. She didn't add anything else, but her hands were shaking. Back at the house that evening, Helen gathered the family in the living room. They sat on the floor, no television, no phones, just candlelight and memory. Emma sat cross-legged, holding a crayon drawing of Bruno and Henry playing under a tree. The tree had golden leaves, even though it was spring. "It's not real time," she said. "It's forever time." Claire and Liam sat close together. Their hands interlocked, their backs resting against the old couch that had seen everything. Weddings, funerals, colic, reconciliation. Helen placed the incense burner at the center of the room beside a bowl of water and a small candle. She looked at each of them in turn. "This isn't a goodbye," she said. "It's a thank you." Liam's voice was low. "How do you thank something that isn't here?" Helen smiled. He's more here than we are. They lit the candle. They closed their eyes. Helen spoke first. Bruno, you came when no one else could. You barked when the machines failed. You lay beside Henry when we couldn't touch him. You stood guard while we slept. You remembered us when we forgot to believe. Claire continued, voice thick. You saved my son. And not just once. You reminded us that love outlives breath. That loyalty has no grave. That family doesn't end, it just changes form. Liam took a breath. You brought us back together. Then Emma, soft, confident. You're my friend. Silence settled, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed. It listened. And then somewhere in the rafters of the old house, a soft creak echoed. Just once, like the tap of a paw, or the shift of weight from one faithful limb to another. No one moved. No one needed to. They knew. Back in the hospital, the nurse working the night shift walked past Henry's incubator and paused. She checked the monitors steady. The oxygen levels perfect. The feeding tube secure. She was about to move on when something caught her eye. Henry's hands were moving, not flailing, not random. They were reaching up, slowly, with purpose. Toward the photo of Bruno, she bent closer. And just for a moment she saw it, in the reflection of the incubator's glass. A shape, golden, sitting just outside the circle of the machines. Watching. She blinked. It was gone. But the monitor spiked just a little. A tiny burst of activity in Henry's brainwave scan. The kind that usually happens when babies respond to music or a parent's voice. She noted it, but she didn't report it. Some things don't need documentation. They just need to be kept, believed, cherished. The next morning, Claire and Liam stood over Henry's crib, watching him breathe. No wires, no ventilator, just a nasal cannula, now low flow. His fingers curled around Liam's thumb. Claire turned to Helen. We want to bring him home next week. They said he's ready. Helen smiled. He's been ready. They stood in silence for a while. Then Emma came in holding a new drawing. It was a family portrait. Mom, Dad, Emma, baby Henry, and Bruno. At the bottom, in uneven 5-year-old scrawl, thank you for barking. The silence came first, then the numbers fell. And just like that, the storm returned. It began subtly, almost too subtly to notice. A faint temperature spike, slight irritability in Henry's breathing patterns, a few red blood cell anomalies in his chart. But subtle is a luxury newborns like Henry can't afford. The attending physician, Dr. Heller, saw the signs and immediately ordered a full sepsis panel. Blood cultures, spinal tap inflammatory markers. At 2:06 p.m., the results confirmed what instinct had already whispered. Neonatal sepsis, gram-negative infection. Henry's tiny body was under siege. And this time it wasn't a machine that had failed him. It was the world. Claire was in the NICU when they delivered the news. Her ears rang the moment Dr. Heller said sepsis, the way ears do when a bomb goes off somewhere far, but close enough to feel the wave. We're administering broad-spectrum antibiotics immediately, he said. But he's not responding yet. His vitals are unstable. Claire whispered, how long do we have? Dr. Heller didn't hesitate. We'll give him 72 hours. If there's no improvement, we'll need to prepare for extubation. Liam was already on his feet. You mean? Claire clutched his arm. She couldn't bear to hear the word withdrawal. It felt too much like surrender. But Dr. Heller didn't flinch. We're doing everything we can. But you need to understand we're running out of ways to help him. That night, the machines returned to their orchestra of terror. The monitors beeped erratically. The lines dipped and fluttered like a drowning heartbeat. Henry's skin turned pale, then grayish at the edges. His breathing, assisted now by a full ventilator, was shallow, his chest barely rising. A nurse named Sophia stayed beside his bed longer than her shift required. Every hour she checked the IV lines, flushed the ports, whispered reassurances as if words could disinfect a bloodstream. Henry didn't respond. He lay still, silent, fighting a war on a battlefield the size of a crib. Back home, Claire collapsed on the couch, unable to keep her body upright. She hadn't slept in nearly 36 hours. Her hands trembled as she tried to text her sister. She typed Henry's sick again and then deleted it. It felt too small, too clean. Emma sat on the floor with her crayon's eyes darting up every few minutes, like she was waiting for someone to say it was all a mistake. Mom, she asked finally. Claire looked at her, unable to smile. Yeah, baby. Emma didn't move. She held her crayon still in the air like she'd frozen mid-thought. He's hurting again, she said. Claire nodded, too tired to ask how she knew. Can I sleep in his room tonight? Emma asked. Claire blinked. What? Emma pointed down the hall. I mean here, on the rug, with his photo. Claire tried to smile. You miss him, huh? Emma just said Bruno said I should be near. Claire's heart clenched. He did? Emma nodded. He said Henry might forget to breathe again, and I need to remind him. That night, Emma lay curled on the nursery floor, wrapped in a blanket covered in little cartoon dogs. The framed photo of Bruno rested beside her, propped up on a pillow, like a guardian watching the doorway. Claire stood in the hallway for a long time, afraid to move, afraid to shatter whatever quiet magic had filled the room. The incense Helen had left still lingered faintly in the air. Warm, grounded, like old wood and home. Claire whispered, watch her too. At the hospital, the hours bled together. By hour 41, Henry's heart rate had slowed to a crawl between bursts of instability. His body was rejecting the antibiotics. His blood pressure dropped again. His oxygen saturation, barely maintained by the ventilator, had begun to dip below sustainable thresholds. Sophia looked up at the monitor and whispered under her breath, Please, little one, just give us a reason to keep fighting. She didn't expect a response. But at 3:11 a.m., something happened. The oxygen tank connected to Henry's ventilator began to blink. Low. She checked the gauge, then frowned. It shouldn't be low. She had replaced it 2 hours earlier. She turned to grab the spare tank from the supply wall and stopped. The tank beside Henry shifted, just a few inches, as if someone had nudged it gently toward the regulator port. Not rolled, not knocked, pushed. Sophia looked around. No one was there. But something inside her twisted, not in fear, but in awe. She switched the tanks quickly. As soon as the new line was connected, Henry's oxygen numbers began to rise. Subtle at first, then sharply. His pulse picked up. His chest lifted a little more with each assisted breath. He wasn't stable, not yet, but he was responding. The next morning, Dr. Heller stared at the chart like it had insulted him. His inflammatory markers are dropping. The night team confirmed. Yes, sir. He started improving around 3 a.m. But the antibiotics weren't changed. No new meds were introduced. No, sir. Only the oxygen tank. Dr. Heller rubbed his face. He should have been too far gone. Miriam passed him a fresh vitals sheet. Maybe someone reminded him. He raised an eyebrow. She said nothing else. Claire and Liam arrived just after sunrise. Henry was still intubated, still pale, still fragile, but he was alive. His numbers were rising. His heart rate had normalized. His oxygen saturation now at 98%. Claire fell into the chair beside him, her face cracking under the weight of 24 hours of fear. Liam stood behind her, silent, eyes glassy. Then Claire noticed it. The oxygen tank, slightly crooked in its position, not in line with the others. Nudged. Shifted. She turned to the nurse. Did someone move the tank? The nurse looked confused. No. Why? Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. That evening, back home, Emma stood in the kitchen doorway, while Claire stirred soup on the stove. I saw him, she said. Claire turned slowly. Who? Emma didn't blink. Bruno. Claire dried her hands and knelt. Where? Emma pointed to the window. In the hallway near Henry's room. He was looking at the door. Then he walked away. Claire swallowed. Did he say anything? Emma nodded. He said, tell them not to give up. He's remembering. Claire felt her throat tighten. He's remembering. Emma nodded again. How to stay, how to breathe, how to be here. Claire pulled her daughter into a hug and buried her face in her hair. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the sky. The storm didn't last long, but it shook the house. Wind whispered against the windows, and somewhere in the living room, a picture frame fell. Claire picked it up the next morning unbroken. It was the photo of Bruno. She set it upright again, and this time she said it out loud. Thank you. At the hospital, Henry's vitals stabilized within the final 12 hours of the 72-hour window. The medical team stood at his bedside, stunned. He beat it, Dr. Heller whispered. He actually beat it. Claire pressed her hand to the glass. Henry opened his eyes, not wide, not fully alert, but open, and then he reached, just slightly, toward the photo of Bruno taped to the inside of the incubator wall. Sophia saw it too, and this time she didn't chalk it up to reflex. She just smiled. Welcome back, kid. Because sometimes storms don't just take. Sometimes they return what they almost claimed. And sometimes a bark in the night isn't a warning. It's a promise. It was the third night without sleep. Claire sat in the blue vinyl chair beside Henry's bed, staring through the incubator wall as if sheer willpower could keep his lungs moving. Every breath sounded like a whisper pulled from too far away. The machines had settled into a mechanical rhythm again, but that meant nothing now. Henry's numbers were steady, but eerily so, like a candle's flame that holds still only before it gutters out. His face was peaceful. Too peaceful. Claire had seen that look before. In other NICU beds, in other mothers' eyes. Peace that wasn't earned, but borrowed. Just before the storm came to collect, Liam had gone to the family lounge to grab coffee and gather himself. Helen had taken Emma home and promised to light another stick of incense. Lavender this time, she said. It's what Bruno liked best. And so Claire sat alone, surrounded by white noise and the low-frequency thrum of machines, doing what a mother's body was meant to do. She reached into the access port and touched Henry's foot. It was warm, but motionless. "Henry," she whispered, "you've come so far. Just stay." Her fingers trembled. "I can't do this again." The monitor let out a long tone, then another. 2 quick beeps, saturation dropping. "Don't," Claire begged. "Please don't." She stood, looked around. No nurse in sight. Then everything went silent. No alarms, no beeping, just quiet. A wrong kind of quiet. She turned to the monitor. It was still on, still running, but nothing was blinking. It was like the whole system had paused. Her stomach dropped. Then the oxygen tank hissed sharply, as if someone had yanked the valve open wider. The gauge spiked, the line pulsed, and Henry exhaled. Not with assistance, not with the ventilator, with his own lungs. It was faint, like the rustle of leaves, but Claire heard it. She leaned in. His chest rose slightly, and again, stronger, and then his eyes opened. 2 small glassy eyes blinking against the fluorescent light. "Henry," she whispered. He turned his head, barely, but he turned. His pupils tracked her hand. She gasped. "Nurse." Footsteps thundered in. Sophia appeared, eyes darting between mother and machine. "What's happening?" Claire couldn't stop shaking. He opened his eyes. "He's breathing. On his own." Sophia checked the vent, looked at the O2 level. Then she stared at the numbers on the screen. "His pressure's stabilizing," she murmured. "Wait." Spontaneous respiratory effort detected. She tapped the display twice, then leaned close. "Come on, baby. Prove me right." Henry exhaled again. Inhale. Chest rising higher this time. Sophia whispered, "He's trying." 2 doctors arrived, Dr. Heller included. They reviewed the footage, checked the vitals, recalibrated the vent settings to passive. Henry continued to breathe, weak, but real. His body had remembered. Claire stepped back, hands to her face. She had wanted this moment for weeks, but now that it had arrived, it felt impossible. Liam burst into the room, minutes later. "What's happening?" Claire turned to him, eyes full of something beyond joy. "He's awake." Liam froze. "Awake." She nodded. Liam approached the incubator slowly, afraid to break the moment. Henry blinked at him. Then miraculously his lips curled, not a full smile, but the echo of one, like recognition through a veil. Liam choked on a sob. "My boy." He reached in and let Henry wrap a single finger around the tip of his thumb. That grip, tiny and feather-light, might as well have been the hand of God. 2 hours later, after Henry had drifted into a calm sleep, Sophia sat alone in the nurse's station, reviewing the security feed. Routine, or it should have been. The footage from 2:46 a.m. caught her eye. She watched as the oxygen tank beside Henry's bed shifted just slightly before the numbers spiked. Just like she remembered. But now she paused the frame, right before the spike. There, between one frame and the next, was a blur, low to the floor, shaped like a crouching animal. For a second, she assumed it was a glitch. Then she played it again, and again. The shape moved, from the far corner of the room to the oxygen tank. There was no sound, no footsteps, no barking, just movement. She turned up the gamma filter on the footage, isolating the shape. It was unmistakable. 4 legs, a low posture, the tail curled upward. A dog, no collar, no idea, no human shadows nearby. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. Gone in the next frame. Sophia leaned back, unable to explain the chill running down her spine. She clicked save, labeled the file 0246M anomaly mov. Then she added, "No entry-exit record. No physical animal present. Motion consistent with golden retriever silhouette. Audio no detection." She didn't show it to the doctors. Not yet. But she forwarded it to Miriam and wrote he came back. The next day, Claire stood at Henry's bedside, staring into eyes that were finally learning to stay open. His muscles twitched now, reacted, flinched. The neurologist had reviewed the footage of his eye tracking. Cognitive responsiveness confirmed. Claire only heard one word. Confirmed. Liam stepped in with Emma, holding a bag of granola bars and a bottle of juice. "Guess who wants to say hi," he said. Emma skipped forward and stood on the stool beside the incubator. "Hey, baby Henry," she said gently. "You scared everyone." Henry blinked. Emma tapped the glass. "I told you Bruno would come." Claire looked up sharply. Emma continued, "He said you just forgot how to breathe. But it's okay now." Then without prompting, Emma pulled something from her coat pocket. A photo of Bruno. She pressed it against the glass, right where Henry could see it. He turned his eyes toward it. His mouth twitched. The machine beside him beeped once, then settled. Claire leaned her forehead against the glass. "He's going to make it," she whispered. Liam exhaled. "Yeah." Then almost as an afterthought, he added, "He's not alone." 2 days later, Dr. Heller reviewed Henry's full workup. "This recovery curve is uncharted," he said. "No intubated neonate with this sepsis load has rebounded this fast." Miriam nodded, but said nothing. Dr. Heller looked at her. "You were on shift that night, right?" She nodded again. "You see anything unusual?" She paused, then said he remembered how to fight. Dr. Heller raised an eyebrow, but she didn't elaborate. She just walked back to the NICU and smiled at Henry. The NICU cameras were reviewed again the following week, this time by a security team, double-checking the facility's response to the oxygen incident. They logged the footage, noted the unexplained motion blur, filed it under non-critical visual anomaly. But one intern watching the footage paused it on frame 1379. He leaned in. There, caught between Henry's bed and the oxygen tank, was a faint shimmer. Not a glitch, not noise. A shape, a presence, not casting shadow, but not casting light either. He zoomed in. The shape's eyes, 2 pinpoints of golden white glow, seemed to look directly into the lens, then vanished. The intern blinked, paused, rewound. Gone. He saved the frame anyway. Titled it Bruno Proof JP, but never spoke of it again. In the weeks that followed, Henry's progress stunned every physician who walked through the NICU doors. He transitioned off the ventilator, then the nasal cannula. His color returned, his appetite grew, and one morning, when Claire walked into the room with a fresh bottle, Henry turned toward her voice and reached. She almost dropped the bottle from joy. His EEG showed perfect function. His infection markers dropped to normal. Every number screamed miracle, but the charts didn't say it. The chart said unexplained improvement, but Claire knew. They all knew. Miracles don't always scream. Sometimes they just bark once and walk back into shadow. They called it a discharge, but it didn't feel clinical. It felt like resurrection. The day Henry left the hospital, the world felt newer, like someone had wiped the sky clean. The sun was unseasonably warm for mid-autumn in Melbourne, and even the hospital windows, usually smudged by rain or resignation, seemed to shine. Claire walked out carrying Henry in her arms, a little heavier than she remembered, a little more real than she ever let herself hope. His breath was even, his eyes wide, and though he'd only just begun to coo, every tiny noise felt like a declaration, "I am still here." Liam held the diaper bag and the car seat like a man who had prepared for this moment 100 times, but never dared to believe it would come. The nurses formed a soft line near the entrance, each offering quiet congratulations, soft touches on the shoulder, and subtle glances at the miracle swaddled in Claire's arms. "He's a fighter," one whispered. "He's a gift," said another. And one nurse, Miriam, leaned in close and said gently, "You take care of him, and tell him thank you for remembering." Claire knew what she meant. They all did. At home, Henry's room had been prepared weeks ago, but no one had dared place him in it. It had remained a sanctuary in waiting walls, painted sky blue, a mobile of stars and clouds hanging over an empty crib, and a tiny bookshelf already filled with stories he'd almost never hear. But now, as Liam unlocked the front door, Claire stepped inside with Henry on her chest and whispered, "Welcome home." Emma was waiting barefoot in pajamas, despite it being the middle of the day. She rushed over and didn't reach for Henry as other children might. She simply placed a gentle hand on his blanket and whispered, "I told you you'd make it." Henry didn't cry. He smiled. Not a full one, not yet. But the twitch of the mouth, the glimmer in his eyes, it was enough. Claire lowered him gently into his crib and watched his arms stretch out slightly, as if recognizing this place, this air. Liam stood behind her, hands on her shoulders, saying nothing because the moment asked for silence. But Emma was already busy. She ran to her art table, grabbed her crayons, and began to draw with urgent practice strokes. "Do you want to show him your welcome home card?" Claire asked. Emma shook her head. "It's not for him." Claire blinked. "It's not?" Emma kept coloring. "It's for him." Claire leaned closer and saw what her daughter had drawn. It was a big golden dog lying next to a crib. Not beside it, next to it, as though he were curled around it protectively. The fur was drawn with care, a soft golden hue that had been blended with yellows and browns. His eyes, colored with a mix of amber and hazel, looked toward the crib, not the viewer. And inside the crib was a tiny baby, wrapped in blue. Emma printed the words across the top of the drawing slowly and with intention, spelling out each syllable. "The keeper of my brother's dreams." Claire felt the breath hitch in her throat. "Emma," she said, kneeling beside her. "Did you come up with that yourself?" Emma nodded. "That's who he is." In the weeks that followed, Henry began to thrive. He took to feeding well. His weight stabilized. His eyes tracked movement. His hands gripped. But what Claire and Liam noticed most, what they could never explain to any pediatrician without sounding like lunatics, was his reaction to a very specific sound. Barking. Not the loud, angry kind. Not growling or sharp yelps. Just that gentle, mellow woof that came from neighborhood walks or distant yards. Each time Henry heard it, his face would light up. Not in surprise. In recognition. As if the sound belonged to a memory he didn't have the words for. Claire began testing it. One afternoon, she played a short video on her phone, a clip of a golden retriever running through a field barking softly. Henry, who had been fussy all morning, immediately calmed, and then smiled. She repeated the test, again. Always the same response. It didn't work with other dogs. German shepherds, terriers, bulldogs. Only Goldens. And only with that same warm-pitched bark. Claire eventually stopped questioning it. Some connections go beyond logic, beyond science. They just are. Henry's recovery brought the family back to something they hadn't felt in months: normalcy. Breakfasts eaten together, late-night giggles when Henry farted in the middle of a diaper change. Liam doing grocery runs again instead of hospital shifts. Claire drinking coffee because she wanted to, not because she had to stay awake. And Emma, always the quiet thread stitching the house together, continued to draw. Dozens of pictures. Some of Henry sleeping, some of their family at the park. But always in the corner of the page, the dog was there. Bruno, sometimes lying under a tree, sometimes walking beside Emma. Once drawn as a constellation above their house, his body traced in stars, paws glowing. She never explained them. She just left them on the fridge, like daily prayers. One night, after Liam had put Henry to bed, Claire stepped outside onto the porch. The wind was cool. The trees rustled like old stories trying to be remembered. She clutched her cardigan tighter and looked out across the quiet street. Then she heard it. A bark. Just one. Soft, familiar. She turned, but no dog. No people. Just air. Still, she whispered, "You don't have to stay, you know. He's safe now." There was no reply. But somehow that silence felt full. Back in the nursery, Henry stirred. Not from pain, not from hunger, but as if something warm had passed by. He opened his eyes briefly, then smiled, and went back to sleep. The conversation happened 3 weeks after Henry came home. Claire had brought him in for a routine checkup. His weight was perfect. His lungs sounded clear. Reflexes were strong. He babbled now random syllables, but loud, curious ones that filled the examination room like music. Dr. Heller went over the charts with his usual calm demeanor, making notes with his silver pen checking boxes. Claire waited, watching Henry swat lazily at a toy giraffe clipped to his stroller handle. Then Dr. Heller set the chart down. "You're lucky," he said, tapping the folder. "You understand that?" Claire smiled faintly. "Every day." "No," he said, his voice firm. "I mean statistically lucky. Miraculously by the books. Most infants with this level of septic shock don't make it. And if they do, they usually don't walk out without a neurological footprint." Claire nodded slowly. "I know." Dr. Heller leaned back in his chair. "The team's still talking about it. Some are calling it one of those black swan recoveries." Claire didn't answer. He studied her. "There's a rumor going around." Her eyes flicked toward him. "That you believe a dog saved your son." Claire didn't blink. "I don't believe it." Dr. Heller raised an eyebrow. She continued, "I know it." He sighed softly, not unkindly, but with the exhaustion of someone who has spent his life categorizing miracles into footnotes. "I respect your journey," he said, "and your family's strength. But I have to say this for your own clarity, your own peace of mind. What happened in that room, the tank, the barking, the improvement, it's all explainable. Glitches, coincidence, unexpected biological rebound. You don't need a ghost dog to make sense of it." Claire stood very still. Henry cooed softly in the stroller. She looked at her son, then back at the doctor. "Explainable," she repeated. Dr. Heller nodded. "Yes." She took a slow breath. "I'm glad you need that. I don't." He opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. I know what I saw. I know what my daughter saw. And I know what Henry responded to again and again. That isn't delusion. That's memory. That's bond. Dr. Heller leaned forward, Claire. But she had already lifted her son from the stroller, pressed a kiss to his temple, and whispered, "You don't need to believe in something for it to be real." Then she left. Back at the house, the wind had picked up. Leaves danced in whirlpools across the backyard. Emma was in her room drawing again. Liam was cleaning the garage, muttering about missing socket wrenches. Helen sat in the kitchen, tea untouched, a photo album open in front of her. She was staring at the same picture she'd returned to a dozen times in the last few weeks. Bruno lying in the grass, eyes half-lidded, head resting on Liam's toddler feet. You couldn't look at that photo and not feel the gravity of what had once existed. Claire walked in and sat down across from her. Helen closed the book. "He's getting stronger every day," Claire said. Helen nodded. "He'll run before you know it." Claire leaned back. "Dr. Heller thinks I'm delusional." Helen didn't even flinch. "Of course he does." Claire smiled sadly. I didn't argue. Helen took a sip of now cold tea. Don't waste breath fighting ghosts with people who've never seen one. There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't empty. Then Claire said, "Do you remember when you told me love doesn't follow the rules of science?" Helen looked out the window. "Still true." Claire leaned in. "I want to do something." "What?" "Honor him." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You already did. You named him the Keeper of Dreams." Claire shook her head. "No, I want to make room for that kind of love again. I want to bring it back into the house, not as a memory, as life." Helen studied her. "You want to get another dog?" Claire smiled. "Not just a dog, his dog." The adoption center was quiet on Sundays. Claire, Liam, and Emma walked in as a unit. Henry was strapped to Liam's chest, asleep in a carrier that had started to look almost comically small. The receptionist greeted them kindly, then led them through a hallway of open kennels. They saw dozens too big, too young, too skittish. Then they turned a corner, and there he was, a young golden retriever, maybe 10 months old, sitting perfectly still in his kennel tail wagging not wildly, just enough to say, "I see you." Claire knelt. The dog tilted his head. Emma stepped forward and pressed her palm against the kennel bars. The dog leaned forward, nuzzling her hand through the gap. Liam whispered, "That's him." Claire looked at the nameplate on the cage. "No name, just a number 479. Emma said softly. "That's not right." Claire turned. "What's not?" "He's not a number." The receptionist smiled. "We usually let the new families choose." Emma looked back at the dog. "His name's Bruno." The dog barked once, and Claire swore, so help her, Henry smiled in his sleep. The ride home was silent. Bruno Segegend, as they quickly began calling him, rode in the back seat, head between Liam and Claire, panting softly. Emma hummed beside him. Henry, still tucked to Liam's chest, didn't stir once. When they arrived home, Bruno walked through the house slowly, like he'd been there before. He paused at the hallway, looked toward Henry's nursery, then lay down at the threshold without a sound. Claire watched him, watched her son, watched the world knit itself back together. That night, the wind rose again. Not violent, not cold, just enough to rattle the leaves outside the nursery window. Claire stood in the doorway, watching as Bruno II curled beside Henry's crib head, resting on his paws. Emma appeared beside her, holding a drawing. She handed it over. It was Henry, sleeping, a new dog curled beside him. But in the background above the window was a ghostly outline, another dog, drawn in silver crayon, watching, smiling. Emma whispered, "Now there's 2 of them." Claire pressed the drawing to her chest. "Good," she whispered. "Let them rest. Let them both rest." Outside, the wind passed by gently. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't sound like something leaving. It sounded like something watching over. It was the kind of afternoon Melbourne only offered when no one expected it. Warm, quiet. Sky like glass, not a single crack of cloud. The park shimmered with late sunlight, the grass lush from weeks of gentle spring rain. You could smell eucalyptus on the breeze, hear children laughing in the distance, the slow rustle of kites rising and dipping like prayers. And there, under a line of tall gum trees, the Campbells were whole. Claire sat on a checkered blanket, shoes off, hair caught in the wind. She watched Liam chasing Emma across the open field, both of them laughing, tripping, rising again. Near them, Henry stood wobbling between 2 small feet, hands lifted like wings, unsure how to fly. Bruno Seguin circled near him, ears perked, tail wagging, not frantic but measured, as if waiting for the moment he knew would come. Henry looked around, at first unsure, then took a step, wobbled, paused, took another. He giggled a wild, open-throated giggle that startled a bird from a nearby bush. Claire sat forward. Liam turned mid-chase, stunned. Emma gasped and shouted, "Go! Henry, go!" But Henry's third step was one too many. He lost balance, tilted sideways, and fell. He hit the ground hard enough for Claire's breath to catch in her chest. But before a cry could even rise, Bruno was there. Quick! Certain. He nudged his head under Henry's arm, then licked the boy's cheek with one long, reassuring swipe. Henry looked up wide-eyed, then laughed. Not a giggle, a laugh, loud, pure, undeniably joyful. Claire covered her mouth and cried softly, not because he'd fallen, but because he'd gotten back up, because something had met him the moment he did. Because even in that small, clumsy collapse, Henry had been caught not by hands, but by love, by instinct, by something ancient and watchful. Bruno lay beside him now, tail thumping gently against the grass, his body curled just enough to shelter, just enough to remind the world that Henry would never be alone again. Later, after snacks and naps and skinned knees and muddy hands, the family lay together beneath the shade of the trees. Emma dozed with her head on Claire's lap. Liam leaned back on his elbows, sunglasses crooked. Henry curled against Bruno's side, one fist gripping the dog's ear like a security blanket. Bruno didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes and rested his chin on the ground, as though he had nowhere else to be. And Claire looked at them. All her son, her daughter, her husband, and this golden creature sent from somewhere she no longer questioned. She thought of how close they had come to losing it all, to silence, to the kind of goodbye that never stops echoing. But here they were, breathing, laughing, living. She whispered, "Thank you," into the wind. Not to any one place, not to a god or a ghost, just outward, to the world, to time, to whatever quiet force had decided this story wasn't done. A breeze swept through the leaves above them. The branches danced. Henry stirred, and Bruno thumped his tail once more. Later that evening, after baths and pajamas and teeth brushed too fast, Claire tucked Henry into bed. He clutched a small plush dog in his hand, one that Emma had insisted they name Bruno the Brave. Claire sat beside the crib and hummed softly the lullaby one of her own mother used to sing. Henry's eyes fluttered. He fought sleep with the pride of the newly mobile. Bruno lay outside the nursery door, paws crossed, ears tilted back, watching, always watching. Emma tiptoed in behind Claire, holding a folded piece of paper. "Can I leave this for him?" Claire nodded. Emma crept forward and placed the paper gently beside Henry's pillow. Claire waited until she'd kissed his head and tiptoed out before she unfolded it. It was a drawing. Of course, crayons in careful strokes, a little boy with a big smile standing in a field of stars. Beside him a dog, bigger than the boy, eyes glowing, tail curled around the night. And above them both, in golden letters, "Some guardians never leave, they just learn to wait in silence." Claire placed it back by Henry's pillow and turned off the light. As the house went still and sleep began to settle in the corners, a single soft bark echoed from the hallway. Not loud, not jarring, just present. Claire didn't move, didn't check. She smiled and whispered, "We know you're here." Narration. Quiet, warm. Some souls never leave. They stay long after breath and bone have faded. Not to haunt, but to guard, to love again. To remind us that no goodbye is ever final, and that sometimes a bark in the night is the sound of love returning home.